My name is Ethan Miller, and for a long time, I believed my life was simple. You're lucky, Daniel used to say, smiling like he always knew something I didn't. I laughed back and told him, I already won, man. I've got Laura. He would nod, proud, quiet, like an older brother approving my choices. Laura and I shared coffee every morning. Don't forget your lunch, she'd say, handing me the bag. I'd kiss her cheek and reply, you take care of the house. I'll take care of us. Those words mattered to me. They felt solid. Daniel came over often. Too often, maybe. Hope I'm not interrupting, he'd say, stepping inside without waiting. Laura would smile and answer, you never interrupt. This is your home, too. I never questioned it. He was my brother. At dinner, Daniel would tease, you married up, Ethan. Laura would laugh. Stop it, she'd say, but she never stopped smiling. I told myself it was harmless. Family jokes. Warm moments. Safe moments. One night, I said, you don't have to stay late. Daniel replied, relax. I'm just helping Laura with the shelves. Laura added, you work too hard. Let him help. I trusted them. I always trusted them. Sometimes I noticed the way Laura looked at Daniel when he talked. You always know what to say, she told him once. He chuckled. Experience, he said. I felt small then, but I buried it. I told myself, you're imagining things. I said it again and again. When Laura stayed quiet after Daniel left, I asked, you okay? She replied, just tired. I believed her. One evening, Daniel said, you've changed, little brother. I laughed. Marriage does that. He stared at me longer than needed. Yeah, he said softly. That word stuck in my head. Laura started texting more. I asked, who's that? She answered, just your brother. I smiled and said, good. Family should talk. My chest felt tight, but I ignored it. Do you trust me? Laura asked one night. I said, with my life. Daniel was in the other room listening. I didn't know that yet. At work, Marcus once joked, man, you're living the dream. I replied, I really am. I believed it when I said it. One Sunday, I heard Laura laughing upstairs. It wasn't her normal laugh. It was lighter, freer. Daniel's voice followed. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and called, everything okay? Laura answered quickly, yes. Too quickly. That night, I asked Daniel, you good staying here so much? He clapped my shoulder. You know me. I've got your back. I nodded. I always nodded. I told myself love didn't doubt. Love trusted. Love believed. But lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt something shift. The house sounded different. The walls felt closer. Laura turned away from me and whispered, good night. I whispered it back, but my voice shook. I didn't know what was wrong. I only knew my home didn't feel safe anymore, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't sleep. I came home early that night, keys cold in my hand, heart light for no reason. Laura? I called, stepping inside. No answer. I heard voices upstairs. A laugh. Not mine. My hands started shaking. I walked slowly. Each step felt loud. I heard Daniel say, you shouldn't worry so much. Laura replied, I can't help it. My chest burned. I pushed the bedroom door open. They froze. Laura gasped, Ethan. I said, what is this? Daniel straightened his shirt. Calm down. I laughed once. Calm down? In my house. Laura whispered, it's not what it looks like. I pointed at the bed. Then explain. She looked at Daniel. He didn't look back at her. Daniel said, you weren't supposed to find out like this. I stepped closer. Find out what? Laura's voice broke. Ethan, please. I shouted. Answer me. She said it quietly. We made a mistake. I said, how long? She cried. It just happened. Daniel added, don't act innocent. You were never around. I stared at him. So you replaced me? He shrugged. Someone had to be here. My ears rang. I asked Laura, "Did you love him?" She didn't answer. I said, "Did you?" She whispered, "I don't know." That was worse than a yes. I turned to Daniel. "You're my brother." He replied, "Blood doesn't mean ownership." I felt something tear inside me. I said, "Get out." He laughed. "This is my family too." I looked at Laura. "Is that true?" She cried harder. "Please don't do this." I said, "You already did." She reached for me. "Ethan, I'm sorry." I pulled away. "Sorry doesn't erase this." Daniel grabbed his jacket. "You'll get over it." I said, "You don't get to decide that." He walked past me without looking back. Laura sank onto the bed. "I never meant to hurt you." I asked, "Did you think about me at all?" She shook her head. "I was lonely." I laughed again, bitter. "So, I deserve this." She said, "No." I replied, "Then why him?" She covered her face. "He listened." I said, "I listened every day." Silence filled the room. I felt small, weak, replaced. I took off my ring and placed it on the dresser. "I loved you." She cried, "I still love you." I said, "You killed that." I walked out of the room. She followed me. "Where are you going?" I answered, "Anywhere but here." At the door, she said, "Please come back." I didn't turn around. This isn't my home anymore. The night air hit my face. I stood on the porch, shaking, realizing everything I trusted was gone. I walked into the darkness, feeling like a stranger living someone else's ruined life. I checked into a cheap motel and sat on the bed staring at the wall. I said out loud, "How did I miss this?" No one answered, and the silence felt louder than shouting. I replayed every moment with Laura and every joke Daniel ever made. I asked myself, was I blind or just weak? My phone buzzed and I already knew who it was. My mother said, "Ethan, please come home." I replied, "I don't have a home anymore." She sighed and said, "Your father wants to talk." I drove there because part of me still hoped for fairness. My father opened the door and said, "Sit down." I said, "Did you know?" My mother said, "We just found out." Daniel was already there, eyes red, voice calm. He said, "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed and replied, "That didn't stop you." My father said, "This family is already broken enough." I asked, "So, what do you want from me?" My mother said, "We want peace." I replied, "Peace for who?" Daniel said, "You don't have to make this harder." I stood up and said, "You already did." My father added, "Blood doesn't mean walking away." I answered, "Blood didn't stop him." My mother cried and said, "Think about the family name." I said, "You're asking me to carry his sin." Daniel whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan." I replied, "Sorry doesn't fix betrayal." My father said, "You should forgive him." I shouted, "You should have protected me." Silence filled the room, heavy and cold. I realized no one was on my side. I walked out without another word. Back at the motel, I sat on the floor and called Laura. She answered quietly, "What do you want?" I said, "I went to my parents." She replied, "And?" I said, "They chose him." She whispered, "I never asked for this." I answered, "But you created it." She started crying and said, "I'm scared." I replied, "So am I." She asked, "Can we talk later?" I said, "There is no later for us." I ended the call and stared at my hands. I told myself, "You were loyal, even when they weren't." The truth hurt, but it was clear. I had lost my wife, my brother, and my parents in one night. I lay on the bed and said, "I'm alone now." The room answered with silence, and I accepted it. I closed my eyes and remember my father saying, "Family first." I whispered, "Not anymore." My chest felt hollow, but my mind felt sharp. I said, "They chose comfort over truth." I stood and looked at the door, knowing I wouldn't return. I told myself, if blood doesn't protect me, I will. The night felt endless, but my decision felt final. I lay back down and said, this pain will change me. I didn't know how, but I knew it would. I thought about Daniel's face and felt nothing but distance. I thought about Laura and felt grief without hope. I thought about my parents and felt disappointment instead of love. I said quietly, I will survive this. The motel clock ticked loudly, marking every second of loss. I sat up and said, they broke me, but they won't define me. My voice sounded strange, but it felt honest. I breathed slowly and felt the weight settle. I knew tomorrow would hurt, but tonight already had. I closed my eyes and let the loneliness stay. I wasn't strong yet, but I wasn't lying anymore. I whispered, this family lost me. The words didn't shake and neither did I. For the first time, I chose myself. I lay still, listening to cars outside and thoughts inside. I said, this is what betrayal costs. No one argued with me, and I didn't need them to. I turned on my side and faced the wall. I felt exhausted, empty, and painfully awake. I promised myself, I won't beg for loyalty again. The promise felt small, but it was mine. I stayed there until the sky began to change. Morning didn't heal me, but it confirmed the truth. I said, they chose him, and now I choose distance. The words felt like a boundary, not a wound. I stood up, ready to leave the past where it belonged. I didn't forgive anyone, and I didn't hate myself. That balance felt strange, but it felt real. I took one last breath and said, this is my line. No one crossed it, and no one followed me. I walked out of the motel knowing I truly was alone. For the first time, that truth didn't scare me. It hurt, but it also felt honest. I stepped forward, carrying pain, clarity, and the beginning of distance. That was the night I finally understood loyalty ended now. Laura knocked on my motel door, like she had every right to be there. I opened it and said, you shouldn't be here. She stepped inside anyway and said, we need to talk. I crossed my arms and replied, say it fast. She looked smaller than I remembered. She said, I'm pregnant. The words hit me like a punch. I asked, is this a joke? She shook her head. No, I laughed, sharp and broken. So it's his. She whispered, I don't know. I stared at her. You don't know? She cried. Please don't yell. I said, you slept with my brother in my house, and now you don't know who the father is? She covered her face. I never planned this. I replied, you planned enough. My chest felt empty, like someone pulled everything out. I sat on the bed and said, I don't exist anymore, do I? She said, that's not true. I looked at her and asked, then where was I? She said, I was confused. I replied, you were careless. She knelt in front of me and said, I'm scared, Ethan. I answered, so was I, and you destroyed me anyway. She reached for my hand. Please forgive me. I pulled away. I can't. She whispered, I need you. I laughed again. You needed me before. She said, I still love you. I replied, love doesn't betray. Silence sat between us. I asked, does Daniel know? She nodded. He thinks it's his. I said, of course he does. She said, he won't help me. I stood up slowly. That's not my problem. She cried harder. I don't know what to do. I said, you already chose. She shouted, I made a mistake. I looked at her and replied, you made many. She grabbed my sleeve. Don't leave me like this. I said, you left me first. My voice didn't shake anymore. I felt cold instead of broken. She said, I'll fix this. I asked, how? She didn't answer. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. These are divorce papers. Her eyes widened. You already decided? I said, you decided the night you touched him. She said, please, Ethan. I placed the papers on the table. Sign them.
She sobbed.
You're really walking away. I answered. I stopped existing to you a long time ago. She said, What about us? I replied, There is no us. She whispered, I'm sorry. I said, Sorry came too late. She stood up slowly. So this is it. I nodded. This is it. She touched her stomach and said, There's a life inside me. I replied, And none of it is mine. The words hurt, but they were true. She asked, Can you at least stay? I said, I won't watch the proof of my replacement grow. She flinched. That's cruel. I replied, So was betrayal. She picked up the papers with shaking hands. I never wanted to lose you. I said, You traded me. She walked toward the door and stopped. If you ever change your mind, I cut her off. I won't. She left without another word. I sat down and stared at the divorce papers. I said quietly, This is my end and my beginning. My hands didn't shake as I signed my name. I felt something harden inside me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping anymore. I folded the papers and said, I choose myself now. The pain stayed, but it no longer controlled me. I stood up, opened the door, and let the past walk out forever. I moved to a new city with one suitcase and no plans beyond survival. When I started my new job, a guy leaned over and said, You look like hell. I replied, Nice to meet you too. He laughed. I'm Marcus Reed. I said, Ethan. He nodded. You'll fit in fine. His honesty felt strange, but real. At lunch, Marcus asked, So, what brings you here? I shrugged. Life collapsed. He chewed and said, Happens. You rebuilding or hiding? I answered, I'm not sure yet. He replied, Figure it out fast. Hiding gets expensive. I didn't argue. Work was simple, repetitive, and safe. That mattered. One afternoon, Marcus said, You don't talk much. I replied, Talking didn't save me. He said, Neither does silence. I thought about that longer than I wanted to. The company offered counseling. I almost declined, but Marcus said, Try it once. Running didn't work before, right? I booked the appointment. Dr. Helen Carter shook my hand and said, Tell me why you're here. I answered, Because everything broke. She nodded. Good. That's honest. She asked, Who hurt you? I said, Everyone I trusted. She replied, And how did you respond? I laughed. I left. She leaned forward. That's not healing. That's escape. I felt exposed. She said, Say it out loud. I asked, Say what? She replied, What you're angry about. I hesitated, then said, I was replaced. She nodded. And I said, I feel ashamed for not seeing it. She replied, That shame isn't yours. I clenched my fists. It feels like it is. She said, Feelings aren't facts. I didn't like that answer, but it stayed with me. After sessions, Marcus asked, How is therapy? I replied, Uncomfortable. He smiled. That means it's working. One night, we grabbed a beer. He said, You angry? I answered, Every day. He said, Good. Just don't let it drive. I said, I don't want revenge. He raised an eyebrow. You sure? I nodded. I want peace. He lifted his glass. That's harder. I agreed. Weeks passed. I woke up early. I ran. I worked. I talked more. At therapy, Dr. Carter asked, What do you want now? I said, Control. She replied, Over them? I shook my head. Over myself. She smiled. That's progress. She asked, Do you miss her? I answered, I miss who I thought she was. She said, That grief is valid. I breathed easier hearing that. Marcus noticed the change. You stand straighter, he said. I replied, I stopped apologizing for existing. He laughed. About time. One session, Dr. Carter said, You're not broken. I replied, I feel cracked. She answered, Cracks let light in. I didn't fully believe her, but I wanted to. I stopped checking my phone for old names. I stopped replaying conversations. When anger rose, I named it instead of drowning in it. I said, "I'm angry," and let it pass. Marcus said, "You're rebuilding." I answered, "Brick by brick." He nodded. That lasts. I didn't dream about revenge. I dreamed about quiet mornings and steady breaths. I told Dr. Carter, "I don't want to win." She replied, "Then focus on becoming." One night, alone in my apartment, I said out loud, "I survived." The words felt solid, not proud, not loud, just true. I looked around and felt something new. Discipline. Space. Choice. I said, "This is my ground now." No one argued. No one needed to. Years passed without asking my permission. I stood in my kitchen one morning, coffee in hand, and said, "I built this." The words felt calm, not proud. At work, Marcus leaned back and said, "Promotion looks good on you." I replied, "I earned it." He smiled. "You stopped shrinking." During lunch, he asked, "You ever hear from them?" I shook my head. "I don't ask." He nodded. That's strength. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. At a company event, someone said, "You seem confident." I answered. I stopped explaining myself. It felt true. I wasn't loud anymore. I was steady. One night, Marcus said, "Ran into someone from your old city." I raised an eyebrow. And he hesitated. "Your brother's name came up." I felt nothing spike. "What about it?" He said, "Not good things." I replied, "That happens." Marcus studied my face. "You're really over it." I said, "I'm past it." Later, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I didn't answer. A voicemail came through anyway. Laura's voice sounded tired. "Ethan, I heard you're doing well." I deleted it without replying. Silence felt cleaner. At therapy, Dr. Carter asked, "What did you feel hearing her voice?" I said, "Distance." She smiled. "That's closure." I nodded. I didn't need more words. At a bar, Marcus joked, "You're the calmest man I know." I replied, "Chaos taught me." He laughed. "Expensive lesson." I raised my glass. "Worth it." Someone else said, "Your brother lost his job." I answered, "That's unfortunate." The truth was simple. I didn't celebrate. I didn't mourn. I let it be. Marcus asked quietly, "No urge to say something?" I replied, "Living well says enough." He tapped the table. "Damn right." I paid off my debts. I upgraded my place. I slept through the night. When people asked, "What changed?" I said, "I stopped begging for loyalty." That answer always ended the conversation. One afternoon, Marcus said, "Laura's struggling." I replied, "That's her path." He nodded. "You're not cold." I answered, "I'm clear." At work, my boss said, "You're reliable." I replied, "I value consistency." He said, "That's rare." I knew why. Dr. Carter asked, "Do you feel powerful?" I shook my head. "I feel grounded." She replied, "That's better." I believed her. At a reunion dinner, someone said, "You changed." I answered, "I refined." They laughed, but I meant it. I walked through my apartment one night and said, "This piece is mine." No one argued. No memories screamed. Just quiet. Marcus texted, "Beer?" I replied, "Sure." At the table, he said, "You won." I answered, "I moved on." He grinned. "Same thing." I shook my head. "No. Winning needs an enemy. I don't." Later, alone, I checked my bank account and closed the app. Numbers didn't excite me anymore. Stability did. I thought about Daniel without anger. I thought about Laura without pain. That surprised me most. I said out loud, "I didn't destroy them." The room stayed silent. I outgrew them. That felt right. The past didn't chase me anymore. It couldn't keep up. I slept easily. woke early, and lived deliberately. If revenge ever knocked, I didn't hear it. I was too busy building a life it couldn't touch. That was my answer. Not loud, not cruel, just undeniable. My phone rang late at night, and I almost ignored it. I answered and said, "Hello." Daniel's voice sounded thin. "Ethan, it's me." I paused and replied, "I know." He said, "I don't have anyone else to call." I asked, "Why now?" He swallowed and said, "I lost my job." I didn't react. He continued, "They blamed me. Everything fell apart." I said, "That happens." Silence stretched. He finally asked, "Can we meet?" I replied, "Talk." He said, "I messed up." I answered, "That's not new." He sighed. Laura left. I asked, "Where is she now?" He said, "Alone." I closed my eyes. "What do you want from me?" He whispered, "Help." I said, "I can't." His voice cracked. "You used to protect me." I replied, "I used to trust you." He said, "I hate myself." I answered, "That's yours to carry." He snapped, "So that's it?" I replied calmly, "Yes." The line went quiet. He said, "You're different." I answered, "I had to be." He asked, "Do you feel good about this?" I replied, "I feel honest." He said, "I ruined everything." I said, "You chose everything." He breathed hard. "I thought I could replace you." I replied, "You tried." He asked, "Is there any chance?" I answered, "No," he whispered. "I deserve this." I said, "I'm not judging you." He asked, "Then what are you doing?" I replied, "Letting consequences exist." He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there and felt nothing sharp, just quiet weight. The next day, Laura called. I answered and said, "What do you need?" She cried immediately. "I'm sorry. I waited." She said, "I lost everyone." I replied, "That's painful." She asked, "Do you hate me?" I answered, "No." She sounded surprised. "Then why won't you help me?" I said, "Because I can't save you." She whispered, "I regret everything." I replied, "Regret doesn't rewind time." She said, "I was stupid." I answered, "You were selfish." She cried harder. "I miss you." I replied, "You miss safety." She said, "I miss us." I answered, "We ended when you chose him." She asked, "Can we meet?" I said, "No." She pleaded, "Please." I replied, "I already gave you my answer." She said, "I'm pregnant and alone." I paused, then said, "That child deserves honesty." She whispered, "So do I." I answered, "You had it." She asked, "Did I ever matter?" I replied, "You mattered until you replaced me." She sobbed. I was weak. I said, "And I was loyal." Silence followed. She said, "I hoped you'd save me." I replied, "I saved myself." She asked, "Is this karma?" I answered, "This is reality." She said, "You're cold." I replied, "I'm healed." She whispered, "Goodbye." I said, "Take care." The call ended. I sat still and listened to my breathing. Marcus texted, "You okay?" I replied, "Yes." He wrote, "Proud of you." I said, "I chose peace." Later, alone, I spoke softly. "I don't need revenge." The room stayed quiet. Life already answered. That felt true. I thought about Daniel's voice and felt distance. I thought about Laura's tears and felt closure. I didn't feel powerful. I felt finished. I stood up and said, "This chapter is closed." No anger followed. No guilt chased me. Just space. I walked outside and felt the night air. I said, "I won't carry what isn't mine." The words stayed steady. Karma didn't roar. It whispered. And when it knocked, I didn't open the door. I sat across from a woman named Rachel Moore and said, I'm not good at pretending anymore. She smiled softly and replied, That's actually refreshing. We were at a small cafe, quiet enough to hear our thoughts. She asked, So, who are you really? I thought for a moment and said, Someone who survived betrayal. She nodded. And who didn't let it rot him? I appreciated that she didn't ask for details. She said, You don't talk like someone chasing approval. I replied, I already chased it and lost myself. She asked, Did you find yourself again? I said, I built someone new. She studied me and said, That takes discipline. I answered, Pain teaches fast. She asked, Are you afraid of getting close? I shook my head. I'm afraid of ignoring red flags. She smiled. That's wisdom. I felt something ease in my chest. We talked about work, mornings, routines. She said, You seem calm. I replied, I earned it. She laughed lightly. Most people don't say that. I answered, Most people don't rebuild from nothing. At one point she said, You don't overshare. I replied, I don't rush trust. She nodded. That's healthy. I didn't feel judged. That mattered. Later, as we walked outside, she said, I'm glad you didn't try to impress me. I answered, I stopped performing for love. She looked at me and said, Good. I went home and stood in my apartment, thinking about the man I used to be. I said out loud, You didn't know better. That felt like forgiveness without excuses. At therapy, Dr. Carter asked, How did the date feel? I replied, Steady. She smiled. Not intense. I shook my head. Peaceful. She said, That's growth. I believed her. Rachel texted later, I enjoyed today. I replied, Me too. No overthinking. No fear. Just honesty. The next time we met, she said, You listen well. I answered, I learned the cost of ignoring. She asked, Does your past still hurt? I replied, It taught me. She said, That's different. I nodded. It is. She didn't ask me to save her. I didn't ask her to heal me. We showed up whole. That felt new. One night she said, You're very intentional. I replied, I don't drift anymore. She smiled. That's attractive. I didn't blush. I didn't deflect. I just said, Thank you. I realized love didn't need desperation. It needed clarity. Alone, I looked at my reflection and said, You're not broken. The man staring back looked tired but solid. I thought about Daniel without bitterness. I thought about Laura without ache. I thought about myself with respect. Rachel once asked, What do you want now? I replied, Consistency. She said, I can offer that. I answered, Then we'll go slow. She agreed. Slow is good. I no longer confused intensity with connection. I no longer begged for effort. I no longer ignored my intuition. I said quietly, This is the man betrayal built. Not angry, not cruel, just aware. When Rachel held my hand, I didn't cling. I chose. I had learned restraint. I had learned self-respect. I had learned that healing wasn't loud. It was steady. And for the first time, I didn't fear the future. I trusted myself to meet it. I stood alone in my new home and said, This is quiet. The silence didn't scare me anymore. It felt earned. I walked through each room and touched the walls like proof. I built this life, I whispered. No one corrected me. I picked up an old photo and said, I remember you. There was no ache in my chest, just memory. I placed it back down and said, You don't owe me anymore. My phone buzzed, and it was Marcus. He asked, You good? I replied, Yeah. He said, You sound steady. I answered, I am. He wrote, Proud of you. I smiled and put the phone away. I sat on the couch and said out loud, I didn't lose everything. I paused. I lost illusions. That felt honest. I remembered nights filled with doubt and said, You survived those. The room stayed quiet like it agreed. I thought about Laura and said, "You are a chapter." I didn't curse her. I didn't defend her. I let the truth sit where it belonged. I thought about Daniel and said, "You were a lesson." That was enough. Rachel called and asked, "How's your night?" I replied, reflective. She said, "Good or heavy?" I answered, "Clear." She smiled through the phone. "I like that word." I said, "Me too." She asked, "Do you still think about them?" I replied, "Sometimes." She said, "Does it hurt?" I answered, "No," she said. "Then that's healing." I agreed. After the call, I stood by the window and said, "I don't need revenge." I let the words settle. I needed truth. That felt finished. I spoke to myself like I would to anyone hurting. "You trusted deeply." I nodded. That wasn't weakness. I continued, "You learned." My voice stayed calm. I remembered who I used to be and said, "You didn't know better." I didn't shame him. I didn't romanticize the pain. I let him rest. I said, "Justice didn't come with noise." I smiled faintly. It came with peace. That was the victory no one could take. If you're listening to me now, I want you to hear this. I didn't win by ruining anyone. I didn't rise by dragging them down. I stood up by choosing myself when no one else did. I said, "Survival is a skill." I learned it the hard way. I added, "Growth is a choice." I made it daily. I walked to the door and rested my hand on the handle. "I'm not running anymore," I said. The past stayed behind me without resistance. I sat back down and breathed slowly. "I forgive myself," I whispered. That was the hardest part. The room felt lighter after. I thought about tomorrow and didn't feel fear. I felt readiness. I said, "Whatever comes, I'll face it." My voice didn't shake. I didn't forget what happened. I integrated it. I carried it without letting it cut me. That was the difference. I looked around one last time and said, "This is enough." Not perfect. Not dramatic. Just enough. I turned off the lights and said, "Good night." The darkness didn't feel lonely. I won quietly. I won honestly. And for the first time in my life, that felt like justice.